I was really intrigued by one effort to rethink economic indicators that you included in your column. That is how we measure GDP and revise it to reflect income going to the rich, to the middle class, and the poor people separately. How would that work, and why would that be good?
It is fascinating. It would be important because, again, when we hear GDP, we assume it's saying something about most people's experiences. And if it's not, we should fix that. And GDP is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. We didn't used to measure GDP. And the effort to measure it came out of the Great Depression when people realized it was important to understand what was going on. And so I think that we should use this crisis and the longer-term trends that contributed to this crisis, like the growth in inequality, to improve our metrics further. GDP was a great advance. Now we should go much further. And there is an effort by a number of economists, Gabriel Zucman, Emmanuel Saez, and the most famous of them, Thomas Piketty, to measure GDP as the income that flows to different segments of the population. So look at how much national income goes to the bottom 10% of earners, the second 10%, et cetera, up to the top 10%. They've done this. They're private academic economists, so it doesn't get nearly as much attention as the government doing it. Plus, they have to use data that they're approved to use, so it has about a 4-year lag. But what I find intriguing is that 2 senators, including New York Senator and the Democratic leader, Charles Schumer, have a bill that would essentially have the government do this. And there's no reason the government couldn't do it, where when GDP is announced, you would get the headline number, GDP grew 3%. You would also hear that for the middle section of our economy, GDP barely grew at all, and for the bottom, it barely grew at all, and for the top, it actually grew 7%, the income flowing to those groups. And I think that would be a much more meaningful way to do it, and I think it's important to do it together. You don't want to do it as some separate release. You want to kind of force us as a society, in the media, politicians, to have one conversation at the same time about who our economic growth is benefiting.
You know, I was thinking about another of your recent columns in relation to this, the one in which you wrote that polarization in American politics, as we usually think of it, is the wrong way to think of it, because it's not both parties are heading to the extremes. It's the Republican Party that's heading to the extremes. But we do now have more of a socialist wing, explicitly self-identified socialist wing of the Democratic Party emerging, pushing things like Medicare for all and federally guaranteed jobs, I think in response to this long-term inequality, looking at the push for something better than just let the market recover in its market ways, and then we'll be in the next bubble, and then we'll, structurally wind up with even more inequality when that bursts. So maybe the Democratic Party is heading more to the left, in fact, and maybe it needs to.
Yeah, I think, look, Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, the former top advisor to Barack Obama when he was president, he's someone that I think a lot of people on the left like to beat up. They have disagreements with him, and so no one thinks of him as
They saw him as too centrist, too establishment, too pro-Wall Street, to be sure.
Yes. And he made a number of enemies among the Harvard faculty when he was president there. And he's not the point here, but the point is no one would see him as some kind of radical lefty, right? And what he said to me recently, I think is a really good thought. People on the left might disagree with the first half of this, but he said, look, I think that the events of the 1960s and 70s and 80s should have moved an open-minded person to the right on economics. We saw essentially the socialist economies in other countries failing. We saw the policies of LBJ lead to inflation, not just LBJ, but we saw the policies of the government leading to inflation, all kinds of things. We saw the Clinton era where they brought down the deficit and it seemed to spark a boom work. On the flip side, he said, look, I think what's happened over the last 15 or 20 years should have moved an open-minded person to the left, which is we've had a growing economy, and yet it isn't lifting the living standards of most people. And I agree with that. And so the idea that the Democratic Party is moving somewhat to the left on things like taxation, on things like figuring out ways to have the government create good-paying jobs, I think that makes sense. My point in the column in today's paper is the more radical ideas on the left, whether you love them or don't like them, remain not the policy of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is not trying to get rid of private insurance. It's not trying to take tax rates up to 70%. It's still willing to compromise with Republicans. It accepts science. It's not trying to prevent certain kinds of people with certain skin colors from voting. It hasn't stolen a Supreme Court seat. And so I think the radical party in American politics today is the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party.